Trump, ran on staying out of foreign wars. Well, we've junked that one.
Donald Trump has decided that it's time for the Iranian regime to go. And if he's going to have any credibility, he's got to see that policy through. It's as simple as that. You get what you sign up for. This is the Middle East. This is what comes with the territory. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, folks. Iran is just over the waterway.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House. Today we'll be discussing the American strikes in Iran and the counterforce waged by that regime.
And the pressures on Keir Starmer and what it means for him and his party.
We're delighted to be joined today by Michael Stevens, Senior Fellow at the RUSI think tank. Now, the only story in town at the moment is, of course, America's attack on Iran and the fallout from that over the past 2 days or so. Tim, what do we know recording on Monday morning?
Well, look, America, with Israel's assistance, basically launched a regime decapitation strike designed to take out the leadership of the Islamic Republic. They have killed, depending on the reports, somewhere between 20 and 40 of the senior people there, including Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader. The reports that his successor has also been killed. People that the British public will have heard of, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former president, who was actually under house arrest for trying to stage a coup to replace the leadership of Iran with something even more militant. He was also killed. And it's, on the one hand, a fairly astonishing intelligence success. The leadership of Iran basically didn't trust itself. It knows it's penetrated by Western intelligence. When the attack started, they knew they needed to get together. And bluntly, they were all in the same place. And either through technical intelligence, signals intelligence, or through a very high-placed mole, Israel and America knew exactly where they were. And the Americans attacked the infrastructure of Iranian ballistic missiles, the nuclear program, and the Israelis went after the people. And at least on the basis of what we know so far, that was a reasonably successful attack. That has obviously now opened a potential can of worms. We don't really know who's going to take over. And Donald Trump even suggested over the weekend that some of the people that he thought would take over have already been killed. So Trump is repeating messages that these attacks will continue. He's effectively saying, either you change your ways or we're going to keep killing you. And to the Iranian people, he said, now's your generational opportunity, rise up. Now, that's going to be very difficult because the regime had a lot of survivability built into it. They have, second, third, fourth, fifth echelon people who immediately step up in the case of someone dying or being taken. And we're now in this very fluxy situation. Britain initially did not join the attacks, and frankly, the government over the weekend got itself in a right mess by not even really appearing to have an opinion on them. And that, we understand, is because the legal advice was that an attack that Trump has made very clear was aimed at regime change was regarded as illegal by Richard Hermer, the Attorney General, and presumably by Starmer himself, who comes from the same international lawyer cadre as Hermer. But that has changed. On Sunday night, the Prime Minister gave a statement to the public, effectively saying that the Americans have asked permission to run defensive strikes out of Diego Garcia and out of RAF Fairford in Britain. His rationale was that Iran responded to the initial wave of attacks by firing off missiles all across the Gulf, targeting civilian infrastructure, targeting hotels in Dubai, that sort of thing. And that British people, 200,000 of them in the region, are at risk. British assets are at risk. Overnight, we've seen a drone attack on RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus, which people say was underway before Starmer publicly made that decision, though it happened afterwards. And now we have a situation where Starmer domestically has got us involved in this set of events, call it a war if you like, and he's going to face the Parliamentary Labour Party this evening, and this is going to be very awkward for him. The opposition parties have divided 2 and 2. The Lib Dems and the Greens have condemned it. The Tories and Reform have backed these strikes. And we now have a massively sort of significant set of events, and no one quite knows how it's going to pan out.
I mean, Michael, Tim there talks about the mood in Westminster and what's happening kind of from a Western perspective. What is the feeling, as we currently know, in Iran and the region, given all of this breaking out in different spheres?
Well, clearly there were a number of weeks where the US was building up to potentially strike the regime. The regime was clearly caught off guard. They did not expect to be hit in the way that they did. There was a belief that there was another round of negotiations coming. But very similarly to almost this time last year, the US went in and took a preemptive strike alongside Israel with negotiations still left to run. So everybody has been caught off guard. It is not the case that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or the UAE knew that this was coming. And as a result, it has been a bit of a scramble, and a very serious escalation has now occurred in the sense that Iran used to limit its responses to military targets in the region. What you've seen now is actually that civilian targets are fair game. I think that's because the regime really does feel like they've got nothing to lose. And so in that situation, it's sort of not quite death or glory, but actually breaking taboos and hoping for help from its friends in the Gulf was just not going to keep it safe from this existential threat that it faces from the US. Why this is quite dangerous is because Trump has said, look, we want your regime to go. We've got no interest in you staying in power. We want the Iranian people to rise up. And the regime wants to stay in power. As we've seen in January, they were quite happy to kill 30,000 of their own people in 2 weeks to stay in power. And now when in this situation, where there are all sorts of dynamics to do with their relationships with Qatar, Oman, UAE, they've gone to hell with this. We're lashing out. And so what you've seen even this morning is a widening of the conflict, unfortunately. Hezbollah, which is an Iranian ally in Lebanon, has been attacking Israel as of this morning. So that conflict has reopened up. You've had Iranian missiles striking RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus. And I think there's more to come. And what worries me is that Iran has plenty of short-range missiles and drones that it can keep using for a significant period of time. Missile interceptors such as the Patriot or the THAAD system are extremely expensive to replace, and you can't do it quickly. So at some point, if this conflict keeps going the way that it's going, you're going to start to see missile interceptor stocks running low. And then I do worry actually about civilian casualties in Dubai, in Doha, Qatar, and other places.
Michael, I've seen a suggestion that the cost ratio of an incoming missile to a defender is about 35-1. So that puts what you've just said in perspective. Can you just tell us about the posture of the other regional powers? I mean, the Saudis, we're told, MBS was publicly saying don't do this, but we're told privately phoning up Trump repeatedly in recent weeks and saying get on with it. The Saudis are obviously regionally probably Iran's biggest sort of competitor on the Arab side. Where are we with the Qataris and the UAE and other people who might have a view on this?
Well, I think partly because of the sort of shock in which this has happened, they've all been caught, on the hop. And what has happened over the last 48 hours, and actually I literally just before we came on saw that the Qataris are now saying that they've broken off all contact with the Iranians. It's clear that the Gulf states, who had invested a lot of time in making sure that they were at least not friendly with Iran, but able to talk to them to de-escalate over the last 12 months and kind of taking Iran's side vis-a-vis Israel, have now said, no, this is not acceptable. You've targeted our civilian populations. There's nothing to discuss at this point. It looks to me like there have been several quiet messages sent from the Gulf, basically saying exactly, Tim, what you've alluded to. Get on with it. If you're going to get rid of this regime, get on with it now. We have to look after ourselves. If you can protect us, all the better. But we're in this all together. There are different approaches in the sense that Oman genuinely believed that there was room for diplomacy. And the Omani foreign minister has decried the US decision and said, look, we were making progress. The Iranians had said they would not enrich uranium, and they had agreed to that. But the sticking point appears to have been Iran's offensive missile capability. So Oman appears to be a bit of an outlier here, partly because they had a lot invested in diplomacy. But seems to me that the other Gulf states are now, look, if this is going to happen and if this is where we're at, then the quicker the better. And let's make sure that this chaos doesn't spill out into our own countries. And look, there are sympathizers with Iran inside those countries. They're worried about, splinter cells taking action. They're worried about disruption happening in their own countries. And the sooner it's over, the better. But bear in mind, their airspace is closed. it's not good for Dubai or Qatar, who are trying to present themselves as these rich luxury destinations for British tourists, to be, being bombed night after night for weeks and looking like a suburb of Tel Aviv, right? So the sooner the better. But look, they do not want to put themselves in the position of encouraging war. I think that's the difference here between, say, Israel and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia doesn't want to look like it's the warmonger in the room.
I mean, you go back to Syria, and Russia was a huge influence in propping up Assad for years. That doesn't seem to be happening this time. The Iranians seem to have picked up the phone to Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and he said, well, we'll offer you some warm words, and that's about it. It doesn't sound like Russia, which is obviously up to its neck in Ukraine, has got the capacity or political interest really in trying to help the mullahs here.
No, there's not much they can do tactically in terms of sending weapons or defense systems to help Iran, and there's nothing they can do in the Security Council. I mean, it's not that Donald Trump was that worried about international law when he began this operation, but as you've seen in Ukraine, the Security Council, because of the veto powers of the US and Russia, is effectively moribund at this point. There was a Security Council meeting on the Saturday. A few strong statements, but it's not going to stop anything. And yes, I do think that there's a sense of the Russians being, look, we're right behind you, buddy. We're right there.
It's the French general in the chateau, isn't it? Going, well done, lads, over the top. I'll raise a glass to you, but that's about it.
Exactly. Iran doesn't have any friends coming to help. Now, obviously, it's not in China's interest for this to keep going. The oil price has now gone up above 80. China would love cheaper oil. Actually, Donald Trump would love cheaper oil, but he's committed to this course now. So he kind of has to see it through. I think that, I've had various people say to me, oh, isn't this costing a lot of money? Surely, financial interests will play out to provide a kind of moderating influence on this. I don't think that's where we're at, guys. Donald Trump has decided that it's time for the Iranian regime to go. And if he's going to have any credibility, he's got to see that policy through. It's as simple as that.
I mean, Tim, I'm slightly sceptical about how this all ends, because I can understand the logic of taking out the Iranian leadership, but I don't understand how we get to that kind of final stage where it ends up falling, in that, as we've discussed, the prospect of a kind of internal revolt seems so slim.
Yeah, no, it does. And Trump is effectively saying you need to do this yourselves. There's not yet any clear plan, and there's not yet any idea of how they might put someone else in. I mean, I think Trump, ran on staying out of foreign wars. Well, we've junked that one. He also ran on not sort of nation building. Now, arguably, when they took out the leadership in Venezuela, they'd had for a protracted period of time conversations effectively with Maduro's deputy, who, while a relatively unsavoury character, was quickly able to step up. And I think what Trump would argue is that by demonstrating a willingness to use extreme force, you can effectively bring the regime to heel. And even if it doesn't collapse completely, you maybe make it behave better. But the rhetoric is very much get rid of these guys. And it's quite difficult to see how, without some kind of foreign help, that they accomplish that. I mean, Michael's point about the oil price is telling. And actually, you've got to feel a little bit sorry for the Starmer government here, because tomorrow is the spring statement at which Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, is going to roll out what was supposed to be a bunch of good news about falling inflation and that sort of thing, and say, look, we're turning the corner on the economy. Oil price over $80 a barrel, that is very quickly going to raise transport costs, raise energy costs, and that's what puts inflation back up. So every time they look like they've got a glimmer of hope, it feels like things are undermining them. But what's your read on the sort of internal, what's been going on in Downing Street, and what this all means for Starmer's relationship with his party?
So I think there are some within Labour who think that he's handling a very difficult situation to the best of his ability, in that you can make the case that actually it kind of helps that there's an inoffensive attack on an RAF Cyprus base, wait until that's involved, then you can shoot that down, then you can say, well, we haven't meant to get involved, but we're acting in self-defence, we're acting in a very narrow and strategic sense.
If the Iranians were trying to help Starmer get involved in the war, bombing RAF Akrotiri, it was a pretty good way to go about it.
Precisely, with no casualties. If you're going to have a drone strike, it's rather nice if no one gets involved at all or killed. So I think that overall, he can now make the case. a bit like the opposite of Trump. Trump sort of said, right, we're going to start this. It's the antithesis of the Colin Powell doctrine, which was that you build a public consensus behind a war, you have many months sort of explain your case. Trump has done none of that.
And also, famously, if you break it, you own it. Well, Trump's doctrine is, I don't own it. I'm breaking it so that other people can rebuild it.
Precisely. And so I think Starmer's taken a very different approach, which is that he doesn't want to get involved in this, but every moment he's been dragged into it, he can say, I've had a step-by-step incremental process. Here's all my working. Look at my homework with Richard Homer. And so I actually think that a number of Labour MPs who were very, very scarred by Iraq, of course, 23 years ago and all the process that, he can turn around and say, look, I haven't actually been proactive in any of this. We've got this guy, this Trump, etc. And there are some in the party who want him to have a much sort of more arm's length distance.
Yeah, they'd like him to do the Hugh Grant moment over this.
Precisely,
but he's already not done that, essentially. I mean, the interesting thing was in that statement he made on Sunday night, he did say we don't want to repeat the mistakes of Iraq.
Yeah.
That's, Starmer opposed Iraq at the time. He thought it
marched on the streets against it.
Marched on the streets, thought it was illegal. The thing I find interesting about this whole debate about international law is that even in Germany, which has the same kind of rules-based approach as Britain has had for the last 70, 80 years, Friedrich Merz has come out and said, I'm not sure international law is going to have a great deal to tell us or say about the current set of events. And there is a slight sense that that kind of worldview that Starmer and Homer had is under challenge even from European allies now, that it's... the kind of certainties that liberal internationalists had built up since the Second World War are beginning to evaporate a little bit. And that seems to me an uncomfortable environment for Starmer and Homer to operate in. What do you think of that, Michael?
I think I would say they've already evaporated. We're in a world where might makes right. Some people call it the law of the jungle. I would say this, I was also against the Iraq war in 2003, but I can see the rationale for why the United Kingdom has allowed its bases to be used to target Iranian offensive missile bases. We have a national interest here, which is that 250,000 British people live within 100 miles of Iran's, missile launch sites. They are under quite severe jeopardy, actually. I don't wish to be hyperbolic here, but at some point the threat level is going to get a lot higher. These are British people. It's not Benidorm. These are working age British people who are economically productive and important to our economy and therefore our national well-being and our national security.
And ironically have moved to the Gulf, not just for the absence of taxes, but they often say, well, it's wonderful. Unlike Britain, where you can't walk safely on the streets, you can stroll down the streets of Dubai and it's crime-free. And now they've got a missile threat over their heads.
Well, absolutely. You can wear your gold Rolex with your sleeve rolled up, but just watch the sky, 10,000 feet above you. So there you go. It's the trade-off. And actually, I've had this conversation with a few of my friends. I mean, I was in Dubai last week. And I've had to say to people, very frankly speaking, I've lived in the Middle East for well over 10 years in different countries. And I said, you get what you sign up for. This is the Middle East. This is what comes with the territory. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, folks. Iran is just over the waterway. When I grew up in the Middle East in the 1980s, the tanker wars were going on furiously. So it's always been a factor of life in the Gulf. The fact that people are earning good money and living well is the kind of sideshow to that. And obviously from the Gulf states' perspective, this is a massive threat to their national security because they're trying to diversify away from oil. To do that, you need, good white collar industries moving in, sustainable types of, economic investments coming that plug them into the global economy. And this is very threatening to their long-term stability. So what I would say here is I do see the rationale for the government getting involved. I don't think it's illegal. I think there's an absolute clear cast iron case for the protection of our own citizens and our own national interests. So I don't think that Starmer is being a warmonger, and I don't think that there's a problem here with taking the steps necessary to defend against Iran. I think what I would say is it needs to be understood for those people that aren't experts in the Middle East that Iran had always limited its responses, apart from in Israel, to military targets. This is not the case now. There have been all sorts of red lines broken as a result of what happened on Saturday.
I mean, Michael, is there anybody in the regime who we can do business with, do you think? Is there a faction that might now try to take over that would be interested in doing a proper deal, that wants a prosperous Iran in a functioning international system? Or is the Islamic Revolution so embedded now that it's almost impossible to think that there are people there we can do business with?
Well, there was always, even back in 2014 and 15, when the nuclear negotiations with the Obama administration were ongoing, there was this notion of hardliners and moderates. And, were the moderates simply the nice wrapping to make it look like Iran was not hardline and messianic and kind of apocalyptic? Look, the issue is now Iran is on the back foot, and there are two calculations it can make. One, we fight as the ship goes down because the ship is going down, whether that's domestically or because of Israeli and American airstrikes, and there's nothing to lose. So just fire everything off and make it as painful for the US and the great Satan as possible. The other one is the whole point of the Islamic Revolution was to survive. What Khamenei taught us was think carefully, tread slowly, and outlast all of this pressure during Saddam's invasion in the 80s, the multiple rounds of sanctions that have come in, in the 2010s and 2020s. And the Iranian regime has survived. The problem is that a lot of those people that propounded that thinking are now dead. My hunch, for what it's worth, guys, is that the people beneath the Ayatollah are a little bit more extreme. They are a bit younger, a bit more prone to, how should we say, rash thinking. And I think this is going to get worse before it gets better.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for watching Coffee House.